Before we get into this chilling story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because countless hours went into uncovering the true events behind this haunting mystery. This story is about 11 slave cane cutters in Natchez who walked into the fields one day and simply vanished, leaving behind questions that no one could answer. A disappearance that shocked a community and became one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in history. In 1944, Natchez, Mississippi, was a town still haunted by the deep scars of its past, a place where the legacy of slavery lingered long after emancipation. The sugarcane fields surrounding the town were vast, stretching as far as the eye could see, and laborers worked from dawn until dusk, bending under the sun and the weight of their tools. These were not ordinary workers. Many were descendants of families who had been enslaved on the very same land decades earlier, their lives shaped by hardship and the invisible chains of systemic oppression. Among them were the 11 cane cutters, whose story would later become one of the most baffling mysteries in the region. These men were known for their skill, endurance, and deep knowledge of the fields. They were familiar with every furrow, every stretch of cane, every hidden waterway that cut across the property. Their lives followed a rigid rhythm dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the demanding requirements of the plantation owners. Yet, despite their familiarity with the land, nothing in their experience could have prepared them for what would happen on that fateful day. The morning had begun like any other. The 11 men gathered with their tools, machetes, knives, and sacks, preparing to cut and gather the sugarcane for the day. Locals recall that the weather was unusually still that morning, the air thick and heavy, almost pressing down on the workers. Birds seemed quieter than usual, and even the usual rustling of the cane in the wind had been stilled. Some of the older residents later described a sense of unease that they felt, but could not explain, a subtle tension that hung over the fields like a shadow. As the men moved into the fields, their movements precise and practiced, they vanished. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, and no indication that they had turned back. One moment they were there, ready to work, and the next, nothing remained but the disturbed cane where they had stepped. The sudden disappearance struck fear into those who witnessed it. Farm hands and neighbors initially assumed the men had wandered off to a nearby town or perhaps taken shelter from the oppressive heat. But as hours passed, it became evident that something far more sinister or mysterious had occurred. The historical context adds another layer to this story. Natchez in 1944 was a community still grappling with the social and economic consequences of segregation and a deeply unequal society. For African American laborers, life was a precarious balance of survival and endurance. The disappearance of these 11 men was not just a personal tragedy for their families. It was a shock to an entire community already familiar with hardship. It challenged the natural order of life in the fields. People simply did not vanish without reason, and yet here was a case that defied all logic. Authorities were notified quickly, and search parties were organized. Neighbors, friends, and plantation workers combed the fields, checking every grove, ditch, and swath of tall cane, but found nothing. No footprints leading away, no tools abandoned mid-task, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the 11 men had simply walked into the earth itself. The initial disbelief soon turned to a pervasive fear, and whispers of the impossible spread through the town. What had happened to these men? Had they been victims of foul play, natural disaster, or something even stranger? For those who had known the men personally, the mystery was unbearable. They had families, children, and routines that had been abruptly and inexplicably interrupted. In a time and place where life was hard, and death often came in unexpected ways, this disappearance was different. It was inexplicable, sudden, and absolute. Over time, the story of the 11 cane cutters became more than a report of missing persons. It became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that even in familiar fields and under predictable skies, something unexplainable could occur, leaving entire communities grappling with fear, grief, and unanswered questions. This first keynote sets the stage for understanding not just the events of that day, but the social and emotional backdrop that made the disappearance so haunting. The men's familiarity with the land, their routine, and their skill makes their vanishing all the more unsettling. It wasn't merely that people were missing. It was that people who should have known the land, who should have been able to navigate the fields without incident, were gone, leaving behind only a silent, restless landscape that seemed to mourn their absence. The legacy of this event has endured because it speaks to something fundamental, the fragility of human understanding when confronted with the inexplicable. It reminds us that even in the most familiar places, under the watch of experienced and capable individuals, the world can still surprise us with events that defy reason, logic, and the explanations of the time. This context is crucial to grasp the full weight of the Natchez mystery and why it continues to captivate the imagination even decades later. The day the 11 cane cutters walked into the fields in Natchez, 1944, and vanished began like any other. Yet it quickly became a moment that no one would ever forget. Early that morning, the men gathered at the edge of the plantation, their tools in hand, preparing to begin a day of labor that had been repeated countless times over the years. They were seasoned workers, familiar with the fields, the rhythm of the cane, and the oppressive summer heat. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, and confident. Men who knew the land and respected its challenges. Yet, despite all their experience, something extraordinary and terrifying was about to occur. As they stepped into the dense cane fields, the air seemed to shift. Some witnesses who were near the edges of the fields later described a sudden hush. Birds stopped chirping, insects vanished, and even the wind seemed to pause. It was an odd and almost imperceptible silence, but for those attuned to the land, it was the first sign that something unusual was happening. The men moved together in their usual formation, swinging their machetes to cut the tall stalks, their voices carrying out in short, clipped instructions to one another. Then, as if swallowed by the earth itself, they disappeared. At first, those who noticed assumed it was a temporary confusion. Perhaps the men had moved behind a ridge, or taken shelter from the heat, or simply drifted apart for a moment. But minutes passed, then hours, and the workers did not reappear. Those on the edge of the fields began calling their names, their voices cracking with growing anxiety. Still, there was no response. No echo of footsteps, no rustling of the cane where the men should have been. It was as if they had been erased from the landscape. As the reality sank in, the first signs of panic emerged. Fellow workers rushed into the fields, machetes and torches in hand, searching row after row of cane. They checked every furrow, every ditch, and even the small, hidden waterways that ran through the property. Yet there was nothing. Not a footprint leading away, not a tool left behind, not the slightest indication that the men had struggled or fallen. It was as though the fields themselves had consumed them, leaving only the memory of their presence behind. The initial disbelief quickly turned into fear. Families waiting for their return grew anxious, and plantation supervisors began organizing formal search parties. Neighbors joined in, combing the surrounding woods, hollows, and riverbanks. Dogs were brought to sniff for scent, but even they refused to follow any trail. It was not just that the men were missing, it was that the disappearance defied logic, science, and any explanation known at the time. No natural disaster, no hidden pit, no swampy terrain could account for the total absence of 11 fully grown men in a field so familiar to them. By the end of the first day, the searchers had covered every inch of the plantation and nearby land, yet they returned empty-handed. Whispers began to circulate, and fear spread rapidly through the local community. Some speculated that the men had been kidnapped, perhaps by criminal elements or outsiders seeking revenge. Others whispered more sinister ideas, that the land itself had claimed them, or that some supernatural force had intervened. The sheer number of men involved made it difficult to believe in coincidence or accident, and the collective shock only deepened as the days passed with no sign of life. The surrounding towns and plantations were drawn into the mystery. People who had never set foot on the Hollingsworth or nearby estates became aware of the event. Rumors grew. Some claimed to see ghostly figures moving through the cane at night. Others reported hearing distant cries or the sound of machetes slicing through empty air. These accounts were inconsistent and sometimes contradictory, but they shared a common theme: the idea that the 11 men had vanished under circumstances that no one could rationally explain. In the immediate aftermath, the disappearance also brought tension and fear to the workers who remained. The idea that 11 men, skilled and familiar with the land, could simply walk into the fields and disappear was terrifying. People began to avoid the area entirely, fearing they too might vanish. The very act of working the fields, once routine and mundane, became laden with superstition and dread. Children were warned to stay away from the fields, and even seasoned workers hesitated to step onto the soil where their colleagues had last been seen. By the end of that week, it became clear that the disappearance was not a temporary absence. The 11 cane cutters were gone, and no one could offer an explanation. Letters were sent, and authorities were notified, but official searches turned up nothing. Over time, the story became enmeshed in local folklore, with families recounting it as a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of the land, the fragility of life, and the mysterious forces that seem to exist just beyond human understanding. This second keynote underscores the moment of disappearance itself, the shock, the confusion, and the growing fear that transformed a routine workday into an unexplainable and permanent mystery. It highlights not only the physical vanishing of the men, but also the psychological impact on the community, setting the stage for the enduring legend that continues to haunt Natchez to this day. The immediate reaction to the disappearance of the 11 cane cutters in Natchez was one of disbelief and mounting panic. As the hours stretched into a full day, and then into several, the urgency of the search intensified. Families gathered at the edge of the fields, calling out for their husbands, sons, brothers, and friends, their voices echoing faintly among the tall, swaying cane. The plantation supervisors, accustomed to overseeing the rhythm of daily labor, were unprepared for an event of such inexplicable magnitude. They quickly organized search parties, but despite combing every inch of the fields, the bordering woods, and nearby riverbanks, there was not a single trace of the missing men. Their tools were left behind, the cane undisturbed beyond where they had stepped, and no footprints led away from the scene. It was as if the men had vanished into thin air. As the realization sank in, the community's initial disbelief gave way to fear. People whispered about curses, restless spirits, or even divine punishment. In a region where folklore and superstition were already deeply ingrained, the disappearance of 11 able-bodied men at once was enough to ignite a mixture of terror and fascination. Elder residents recalled stories of the land claiming souls, of fields where tragedy had occurred before, and some began to speculate that the same forces might have been at work here. Children were told not to wander near the cane fields, and adults hesitated even to speak the men's names aloud, fearing that mentioning them might draw attention from whatever had taken them. Local authorities were involved quickly, but they too found themselves frustrated. Sheriff deputies combed the surrounding area, questioning neighbors and other workers. They searched the waterways and lowlands where men might have accidentally fallen or become trapped. Dogs were brought to track their scent, but even the trained animals could not pick up a trail. Each failed attempt deepened the sense of dread. Newspapers reported on the incident, though details were sparse, and the public was left to imagine the worst. The story spread beyond Natchez, reaching nearby towns and communities, where rumors flourished, some suggesting that the men had been kidnapped, others that they had been taken by something supernatural. The psychological impact on the remaining workers was profound. Those who had worked alongside the 11 men became fearful and hesitant. The fields that had once been a source of livelihood now seemed ominous and threatening. Some claimed to hear rustling in the cane when no wind blew, or fleeting shadows moving among the stalks. Superstitions grew quickly, and seasoned workers who had navigated the land without issue for years refused to enter the fields after the disappearance. The very act of labor, once familiar and predictable, became laden with apprehension and dread. Search efforts expanded as neighboring communities joined in. Volunteers scoured the surrounding forests, swamps, and riverbanks, but each day yielded the same result: nothing. There were no signs of struggle, no abandoned belongings, and no physical evidence to explain what had happened. Each passing day made the disappearance more perplexing, and the combination of fear and frustration began to affect the local populace emotionally and socially. Families of the missing men were left in a state of limbo, not knowing whether their loved ones were dead or simply lost. Neighbors struggled to carry on with daily life, as the collective unease cast a long shadow over the community. Rumors and speculation flourished in the absence of answers. Some claimed to have seen ghostly figures moving through the cane at night, while others swore that they could hear distant, anguished cries emanating from the fields. Certain townspeople believed that the men had been taken by forces beyond human understanding, perhaps spirits bound to the land or entities that existed just outside the realm of ordinary perception. These ideas, though unprovable, gained credibility in the community because of the sheer impossibility of the men's disappearance. By the end of the first week, the incident had begun to take on the characteristics of a legend. It was no longer just a report of missing persons. It became a story of the inexplicable, a collective experience that united the community in fear, grief, and fascination. The fields, once ordinary and familiar, now held a menacing presence. A silent reminder that life could change in an instant without explanation. Work slowed as the remaining laborers approached the land with caution, and a palpable tension hung over Natchez. The third keynote highlights not only the initial search and the community's reactions, but also the broader psychological and social consequences of the disappearance. It emphasizes how a single unexplained event can ripple through a population, altering behavior, beliefs, and perceptions of the familiar. This reaction sets the stage for understanding why the Natchez cane cutter disappearance has endured in local memory as a story that is both terrifying and enigmatic, a mystery that continues to evoke fascination decades later. The strange rumors and unexplained occurrences that followed the disappearance of the 11 cane cutters in Natchez spread quickly throughout the surrounding area, fueling fear and speculation. People began to report events that could not be easily explained, each story adding another layer to the mystery and deepening the sense of dread surrounding the fields. Neighbors spoke of seeing fleeting shadows moving through the cane at night, even when no one was working there. Others claimed to hear voices calling out names, soft at first, but growing louder as if the missing men were nearby, yet impossible to locate. The fields themselves seemed to hold a presence, as though they remembered what had occurred within them, and were now a living, breathing entity that demanded respect and caution. One particularly chilling account came from a local farmer who had been passing near the plantation at dusk. He reported seeing the silhouettes of 11 figures walking silently among the cane, perfectly aligned as though marching in formation. When he approached, they vanished into thin air, leaving no footprints or signs of passage. He was so shaken that he never worked near the fields again, warning others of the strange forces that seemed to inhabit the land. Such sightings were sporadic and inconsistent, but their persistence created a growing belief that something beyond the natural world had taken the men, a force that could manipulate reality itself. Other unusual phenomena were reported in the days following the disappearance. Families near the fields claimed that tools would disappear and reappear in odd places, and livestock sometimes acted erratically, refusing to enter the cane or suddenly panicking for no apparent reason. Some residents even reported a sudden drop in temperature around certain areas of the plantation, as if a cold, unseen presence lingered where the men had last been seen. These occurrences, combined with the disappearance itself, created an atmosphere of pervasive unease, making locals hesitant to venture into or even speak of the fields openly. Religious and spiritual interpretations quickly emerged as well. Some townspeople believed that the men had been claimed by a curse, perhaps tied to the historical weight of slavery in the region. Others thought that the fields had been haunted by restless spirits, and that the disappearance was a warning or punishment. Clergy in the surrounding area were consulted, and prayers were offered for the men's safe return, yet no answers or solace were found. The persistence of strange events only strengthened the belief that something inexplicable had occurred. something that could not be measured or understood by science or human reasoning. Even neighboring plantations reported unusual experiences, further amplifying the mystery. Workers who had no connection to the 11 men spoke of seeing sudden flashes of light in the fields at night, hearing distant cries or whispers, and feeling an unexplainable pressure or presence around them. These reports were never consistent, and no two witnesses described exactly the same events, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. A fear that something unseen and possibly malevolent was associated with the disappearance. The combination of personal experiences, community lore, and the sheer improbability of the event created a story that refused to fade from memory. The media, too, became intrigued by the case, though newspapers at the time reported cautiously, often framing the events in terms of mystery rather than fact. Journalists relayed witness accounts of the strange occurrences, including ghostly sightings, unexplained voices, and odd atmospheric changes around the fields. Each report added to the growing sense that Natchez was the site of something beyond ordinary comprehension. Readers were captivated by the story, debating whether it was a tragic accident, an elaborate hoax, or the result of supernatural forces. The lack of concrete evidence only fueled speculation and allowed the mystery to grow in the public imagination. The spread of these rumors and unexplained events had a profound effect on the local community. Fear became a constant companion, shaping behavior and interactions. Parents kept their children away from the fields, and workers avoided the area, even when employment demanded it. Stories of sightings and strange phenomena were passed down orally, transforming the disappearance into a legend that entwined history, fear, and the supernatural. Even decades later, older residents of Natchez would speak of the events with a mix of reverence and terror, warning younger generations of the strange forces that had taken the 11 men and haunted the fields ever since. This fourth keynote emphasizes how the disappearance was not an isolated event, but part of a series of unexplained occurrences that compounded the community's fear. The rumors, ghostly sightings, and unusual phenomena created a pervasive atmosphere of dread, transforming a simple missing person case into a deeply entrenched legend. It highlights the role of perception, superstition, and the human need to find patterns in the inexplicable, showing how the story of the 11 cane cutters became not just a mystery, but a haunting presence in the cultural memory of Natchez. The theories surrounding the disappearance of the 11 cane cutters in Natchez were as varied as they were perplexing, reflecting the community's desperate need to make sense of the unexplainable. In the absence of concrete evidence, speculation quickly took hold, ranging from the logical to the supernatural, and each theory seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. Some of the earliest and most straightforward theories suggested foul play. People wondered if the men had been targeted by criminals or rival laborers, possibly abducted for ransom or revenge. Given the social tensions in Natchez at the time, with labor disputes and lingering racial hostilities, such explanations were plausible, yet the total lack of evidence, no footprints, no signs of struggle, no personal belongings removed, made even these theories difficult to accept. Others considered the possibility of an accident. The fields of Natchez were crisscrossed with hidden waterways, ditches, and dense cane that could easily disorient even experienced workers. Some theorized that the 11 men might have wandered into a hidden swamp or a sudden sinkhole, and that the land itself had claimed them. However, extensive searches by local authorities, neighbors, and volunteers failed to uncover any physical trace of such hazards. The sheer improbability of all 11 men falling victim to an accident simultaneously deepened the mystery, leaving many to dismiss natural explanations as insufficient. As logical explanations faltered, the community increasingly turned towards supernatural interpretations. Stories circulated that the men had been claimed by vengeful spirits, perhaps tied to the plantation's dark history or to the centuries of slavery that had stained the land. Some believed that the fields themselves were cursed, that the very soil had absorbed the pain and suffering of generations, and, in some inexplicable way, reached out to claim the lives of those who worked upon it. These theories, while unprovable, resonated strongly in a community where folklore and oral tradition held significant influence, offering a framework, however unsettling, for understanding an event that defied reason. Religious interpretations also played a central role in forming theories. Local pastors and preachers were consulted to pray over the fields and bless the land, yet even their efforts seemed to have no effect. Some parishioners believed the disappearance was a form of divine punishment, a warning from God for sins committed either by the men, the plantation owners, or the community at large. Others saw the event as a test of faith, a reminder that human understanding was limited and that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. Sermons and gatherings often included references to the incident, framing it as both cautionary and spiritual, and the story became entwined with the moral and religious fabric of the region. Over time, fringe theories emerged, ranging from the bizarre to the eerie. A few claimed that the men had been abducted by extraterrestrial forces or whisked away by unknown entities that existed beyond human comprehension. Others suggested that the fields were a kind of portal, a thin boundary between worlds, and that the cane cutters had unknowingly crossed into a realm invisible to the living. These ideas, though largely dismissed by authorities, persisted in the collective imagination because they offered a narrative for something so utterly inexplicable, a way to reconcile the absence of the men with the deep-seated human need for explanation. Even decades later, researchers and storytellers have attempted to revisit the case, analyzing historical records, newspaper reports, and oral histories to uncover new clues. Yet every investigation seems to confirm the original enigma. The 11 men entered the fields and vanished without a trace. No theory has gained universal acceptance, and each proposed explanation, whether natural, criminal, or supernatural, is met with equal skepticism and intrigue. This uncertainty is what has allowed the story to endure, evolving into a legend that blurs the lines between fact and myth. The persistence of multiple theories highlights the human struggle to understand the unknown. In the absence of evidence, people fill gaps with speculation, drawing on personal beliefs, cultural narratives, and societal fears. The Natchez disappearance illustrates this perfectly. The community's explanations reflect both the historical context of the time, a racially and socially tense Mississippi in the 1940s, and the timeless human tendency to seek meaning in the inexplicable. The very diversity of theories, from the logical to the paranormal, underscores the event's profound impact, showing how one moment can ripple through generations, shaping memory, folklore, and local identity. Ultimately, the range of theories does not solve the mystery, but deepens it, allowing the story to persist in the collective consciousness. Each explanation, whether grounded in reason or imagination, keeps the narrative alive, inviting new generations to ponder the fate of the 11 men. It is this combination of uncertainty, fear, and fascination that ensures the disappearance remains one of Natchez's most enduring and haunting mysteries, a story that continues to provoke questions, inspire speculation, and chill the imagination more than 70 years later. The enduring mystery of the 11 cane cutters, who vanished in Natchez, has left a lasting mark on the local community and the region's collective memory. Even decades after the incident, the story continues to be told, passed down through families, whispered at gatherings, and recounted by historians, folklorists, and curious travelers. It has become more than just a missing person case. It has transformed into a legend that embodies the fear of the unknown and the fragility of human understanding in the face of events that defy explanation. The fields where the men disappeared are now shrouded in a sense of foreboding, and even those who did not witness the original events feel the weight of the mystery when they venture near. Local residents often speak of a lingering presence in the area, describing a heavy stillness in the cane fields and a strange feeling that they are being watched. Some claim that at certain times of day, particularly at dawn or dusk, the fields seem to shift in subtle ways, shadows moving unnaturally. Sudden drops in temperature, or the faint rustling of cane where no wind blows. Others have reported hearing distant voices calling out, faint cries, or even the sounds of tools striking cane, as though the missing men are still at work in a dimension beyond the one we can perceive. These accounts, while anecdotal, reinforce the sense that the land itself remembers, and that the 11 men have become an inseparable part of its history and folklore. The legend of the cane cutters has also influenced local culture in more tangible ways. Writers, storytellers, and journalists have recounted the tale in articles, books, and oral histories, preserving it for future generations. Tour guides in Natchez sometimes include the story as part of historical tours, emphasizing the mysterious and unsettling nature of the disappearance. Some even claim that the story carries a moral or cautionary aspect, warning of the unpredictability of life and the limits of human control over the natural world. The tale has become intertwined with the identity of the area, a haunting narrative that reminds both locals and visitors of the past shadows. Over time, the event has attracted attention from researchers and paranormal investigators, all drawn by the unexplained nature of the disappearance. Expeditions into the cane fields, though largely anecdotal, have reported unusual phenomena, cold spots, disembodied sounds, and fleeting shadows that some interpret as signs of lingering energy connected to the 11 men. Even without concrete evidence, these experiences contribute to the narrative that the disappearance was not merely physical but metaphysical, an event that left an imprint on the land itself. Families of the missing men, though many are long gone, have preserved the memory of their lost relatives. Stories of fathers, sons, and brothers who never returned to their homes have been told around dinner tables, passed from one generation to the next. These personal histories keep the memory of the cane cutters alive, blending grief, mystery, and folklore into a shared cultural consciousness. The disappearance, once a shocking news event, has become a story that binds the community together, a collective experience of fear, loss, and curiosity. Even in modern times, visitors to Natchez are struck by the eerie resonance of the tale. Travelers often report an inexplicable chill when passing through the area, or a strange sense of unease when approaching the fields. Some claim to have seen fleeting figures in the distance or heard faint cries carried by the wind, while skeptics dismiss these experiences as imagination or coincidence. The persistence of these reports reinforces the sense that the story is alive, continuing to shape perceptions and experiences long after the event itself. The enduring mystery also reflects a deeper human fascination with the unknown. People are drawn to stories that defy explanation because they challenge our understanding of reality and remind us of our vulnerability. The disappearance of the 11 cane cutters taps into this primal curiosity, leaving unanswered questions that fuel speculation, storytelling, and folklore. It is precisely this unresolved nature that ensures the story continues to captivate and terrify, allowing it to transcend the historical moment and remain a part of cultural consciousness. Ultimately, the legacy of the 11 missing cane cutters is one of memory, mystery, and the human need to make sense of the inexplicable. The event has become a symbol of how sudden, unexplained occurrences can ripple through a community, leaving emotional, cultural, and even supernatural echoes. The fields of Natchez, once ordinary and productive, now carry a weight of history, fear, and legend that cannot be erased. And as long as the story is told, whether through oral tradition, historical accounts, or personal experiences, the memory of the 11 cane cutters, who vanished forever, will continue to haunt, reminding all who hear it that some mysteries are timeless and that the unknown will always command a measure of awe and respect.